sight was obscured by the darkness because we didn't focus our light on it. As a result of seeing the snake, we became filled with fear and worry. We found out it was only a rope. The appearance of the snake dissolved. We saw the rope, and then our fears dissolved. We became very happy and joyful. We felt relief. Now we can compare the rope to the personality, the complex of the five aggregates. We can compare the snake to the idea of a self or ego. Because of our ignorance, we don't see the five aggregates as they are, as simply five aggregates, but we see them as a self, as a substantial ego. And as long as we lack direct insights, wisdom, we go on taking the aggregates to be self, and we evaluate all our experience from that perspective, from the standpoint of ego clinging. But when we develop wisdom, we can apply that wisdom to our personality, the way we apply the flashlight to the rope. And then we see the person as being just the complex of the aggregates, without being the self, without containing the self. To make the teaching of anatta clearer, we have to investigate two things more carefully. First, what exactly is the nature of selfhood? What does the notion of being a self involve? And secondly, why is the person not a self? What are the reasons for negating selfhood in the five aggregates? We'll take each question in turn. First, we want to see what the idea of self involves. If we examine our ingrained notion of selfhood, what we unconsciously assume when we take ourselves to be a self, I think we'll find that it involves four ideas. These might be called the criteria of selfhood. There might be other ideas lying implicit, but these seem to be the four ideas that are dominant, at least that I've discovered. First, there's the idea of duration or lastingness. We think that the self has to be some kind of entity which endures, which persists through time. It might be a temporary kind of duration. If we hold, for example, that our self came into existence at birth, continues as the same self throughout life, and then is finally annihilated at death. Or else it might be a permanent type of duration. When we think of the self as something that comes into being perhaps at birth, maybe even exists before birth, it continues as the same self throughout life, and then it survives forever into the future. That is, we have the idea of a permanent, everlasting, and eternal self. So this is first the notion of duration or lastingness. The second idea involved in the notion of selfhood is that of simplicity. By this we mean that the self is conceived to be an incomposite entity, something which is not compounded, not analyzable into parts, something that possesses a basic simplicity or indivisibility. The third idea implicit in the notion of selfhood is being unconditioned. We think that the self must possess its own power of being. It must be self-sufficient, unconditioned, not dependent entirely upon causes and conditions. If something exists through conditions, if it is entirely dependent on conditions, then we can't identify with it. It doesn't seem to be us, but to belong to the conditions which sustain it. So the self is conceived of as being a self-sufficient or unconditioned entity. Then the fourth idea involved in the notion of selfhood is that of being susceptible to our control. In Pali, this is vasavatita, being susceptible to control. What this means is this. If something really belongs to us in our essence, if we consist in this, then if it can be identified as ourself, then we should be able to exercise mastery over it, to control it, so that whatever we determine it should be, it would follow our determination. There would never be any conflict between what we want our self to be and what it becomes. The thing that's taken to belong to us, to be ourself, would always conform to our notion of what it should be. Would be able to control it, to exercise mastery over it. So these are the four basic notions that enter into the concept of a self. The notions of permanence, of simplicity, of unconditionedness, and of being susceptible to our control. And now we should examine our personalities, the five aggregates, in the light of these ideas. Ordinarily, we don't do this. We simply assume that we have a self. We don't bother to investigate the idea of self close up. We don't try to give the idea any substance. And thus the idea of self remains as a kind of specter, a phantom lurking behind our experience and our actions, something very vague and undefined. But for a thinker, for one seeking truth, this ambiguous view of self isn't sufficient. If there is a self, we have to try to pin it down, to define it, to find what it is. And when we try to conceive a self, to give it some content, it has to be conceived in relation to what is directly experienced. That is, the body and mind, the five aggregates. If the idea of self is to have any meaning, any content, it has to be set in relation to the body, the feelings, the perceptions, the formations of mind and consciousness. Without positing any relation between the two, then it becomes just a word, a completely empty notion. Now, when we try to posit the self in relation to the five aggregates, a number of relations are possible, but these can all be reduced to two, either identity or difference. That is, when we conceive ourselves to be a self, we must do so either by identifying the self with some aspect of the body-mind complex, or else by distinguishing the self from the body-mind complex. In the second case, the self is seen as distinct from the